Georgia had a really simple game plan to beat Tennessee. Really simple as it gets, truthfully. And that's not a knock against the Volunteers or anything like that, because I think they prove that they're a pretty good football team. Now, Georgia's an interesting college football playoff case now because they've got wins over Texas and Tennessee, and they got losses to Ole Miss and Alabama. So their college football playoff case is really kind of interesting because I think you could probably argue that outside of Oregon's win over Ohio State, that that Georgia might have the two best wins in college football in the playoff race. Throw in the win against Clemson, they might have two of the top five wins in college football this year, and then they've also got two losses. So it's a really interesting case study that we'll probably talk about later in the week, especially after the college football playoff rankings come out, when Alabama is probably still going to be ranked above Georgia, and when Ole Miss is probably still going to be ranked above Georgia. But we'll talk about that later. The game for Georgia last night was incredibly simple. We can't beat ourselves. That was it. I don't know how much. Uh, Obviously, they prepared and all of those things for Tennessee, but I would bet you a good portion of Georgia's practices this week were dedicated to we cannot beat ourselves. We can't take penalties. We can't turn the ball over. Nobody had turned the ball over as much as Carson Beck had in the last couple of weeks. And that's not an exaggeration. Literally, nobody had turned the ball over more than Carson Beck and the Georgia Bulldogs in the last couple of weeks. And so when those are the problems, those are the things that you need to rectify, you're in a pretty good spot. When you are in, hey, we don't think the other team can beat us. We just can't beat ourselves. That's a really good spot to be in, because when you only have to work on what you're doing instead of, preparing for a ridiculous challenge or something like that. And again, not a knock against Tennessee. It's just Georgia was in a spot where they are probably 10-0 coming into, or 9-0 coming into the matchup against Tennessee if they don't beat themselves. But they beat themselves twice. Make really no mistake about it. And so when that's what you have to change, that's what you have to fix, practice can be somewhat easy, because when all you're doing is building your own confidence back up that, hey, we're not going to make stupid decisions with the football. We're not going to have ill-timed penalties. We're not going to be bad in special teams. Those are somewhat easy problems to rectify. And Georgia didn't beat themselves on Saturday night. And that's the difference in the game. If you got to make somebody beat you rather than you beat yourself, college football gets pretty simple. There's a reason that the team that is favored to win wins like 85% of the time. Because essentially you got to make them beat you or you beat yourself. Georgia didn't have that on Saturday night. That's why they've won and Tennessee lost. Now, I think Tennessee's got an interesting case as well in the college football playoff, because they now have two losses. Um, like Alabama, Tennessee has a bad loss against Arkansas, and then their other loss is against a team who's going to be ranked in the top 7 in the country. So I don't. I think Tennessee might be susceptible to they're ranked 11th and they don't get in the college football playoff because the 5 conference champions are guaranteed a spot, and BYU could be ranked below them, but yet jump them into the college football playoff. And if that happens, make no mistake about it, if that happens, all hell will break loose. And the way the playoff is constructed right now will be talked about like you will not believe, because everybody was fine with it. maybe not fine with it. Everybody was accepting and understanding of it until it got put into practice. And there is a case to be made for rankings and seeding. And when people look at the rankings right now, I don't think that the average fan recognizes the seeding, even if they, no matter how many times they throw the bracket on the screen and how many times you explain it. There's a difference between seeding and ranking. And when that is going to be brought up, and when you're going to be staring at the face of it, when it's actually put in place, when it's actually go time for the playoff, and you go, oh, wait a second, how is the number 2 team in the country the number 5 team? I don't think people are going to like it. But again, a different discussion for a different day. I think there's also a conversation to be had about BYU. Got their first loss last night against a bad Kansas team. And it's the similar thing that we talked about, like I've talked about last week with Ole Miss. Like Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. And the idea that, like, well, Ole Miss would beat the brakes off of Indiana. Tennessee, Alabama would beat the brakes off of Indiana. And Indiana would probably beat the brakes off of Vanderbilt and Kentucky and Arkansas. So at the end of the day, what happens on the field has to matter. A hypothetical of Tennessee would beat Indiana. Okay, well, we could hypothetically say Indiana would beat Arkansas. Tennessee would, or Indiana would beat Vanderbilt. Indiana would beat Kentucky. And we've sort of had similar conversations with BYU, where those SEC schools would beat BYU. Yeah, probably. But they lost last night and to a bad team. And those losses have been held against Tennessee and been held against Alabama and been held against Ole Miss. The problem for BYU is there was not as big of a margin of error for them as there was for Tennessee, for Ole Miss, for Alabama. So I don't know what happens to the Cougars. I would not expect to see them still inside the top 11, still inside the top 12. I think Boise State, even going back that deep into the rankings, is probably ranked above BYU on Tuesday night. And so that throws in the, are you giving false hope to somebody like a Tennessee who might be ranked 11th? That, hey, you got a shot at the playoff still, but it's going to boil down to conference champions. I don't know. I think we're in for a bit of a mess the last couple of weeks of the season, which is fun, which is part of the excitement of college football. Is, hey, like, this is going to be chaotic and disgusting, and we're not going to know a whole lot, and the committee could completely change whatever the hell they were looking at in the first couple of weeks of the rankings, and everything could go 100% by the wayside. That's as valid of a possibility as, like, Georgia losing to Georgia Tech. All of those things can happen. And so I think we're in for a bit of a wild ride here over the course of the next couple of weeks. Sunday Stiff Arm Trophy update time. I don't have a Heisman Trophy built. I wish I did. But here's what my ballot would look like this week. It's inching closer and closer and closer. I would still vote for Ashton Genty because I put a high value on when I put a high value on running backs, that when the other team knows that you're going to get the football and they still can't stop you, I put a high value on that. And I think the argument generally with a group of 5 players in the Heisman Trophy ballot, or in Heisman Trophy race, is, oh, well, yeah, but he's doing it against Mountain West defenses. Yeah, he is. He's also doing it with Mountain West offensive linemen and a Mountain West quarterback that doesn't take really any pressure off of him, and Mountain West wide receivers and Mountain West coaches. And it's not like he didn't perform against the number 1 team in the country in Oregon earlier this season. So Ashton Genty would still be my Heisman Trophy winner today. I think Dylan Gabriel and Cam Ward are each um, kind of inching their way closer and closer and closer. And it's just basically because I think for Ashton Genty to win, he's got to have ridiculous stats. I mean, flat out just nuts. And he has fallen back to earth a little bit with the idea that only rushing for 159 yards and 3 touchdowns is falling back to earth. But I think for a group of 5 player to win the Heisman Trophy like that, they've got to be, um, those Barry Sanders type numbers, and he's not going to get there. But it's still just a absolute boatload of touchdowns for a team that is highly regarded. I mean, he's got 26 touchdowns and almost 2,000 yards, averaging 7.5 yards per carry. I think to me, that's enough to put him in the list. And I know that there's going to be a discussion about Travis Hunter. I don't think Travis Hunter is producing enough to be in that race. He got an interception on Saturday in garbage time that was a deflection. He had a rushing touchdown. They are using him, and I think they're using him in an effort to, and he's the consensus, I think, favorite to win the Heisman right now, which feels crazy to me because while I can't hold it against him that his coach lets him play wide receiver and cornerback, I think it's as much that very many other coaches don't let their players do that. And I think it's impressive what he has done, especially from like a conditioning standpoint. But overall, I don't think the production is there enough to look at that and say, hey, he is deserving of the biggest individual honor in sports. You can argue with me in that with that in the comments. I'd love to have that discussion in the comments down below. So drop them and tell me that I'm an idiot, and we'll have that discussion. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you are watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you are listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.